The middle class has to pay for everything. The poor don't have it, and the rich have it hidden. Will Rogers.
Throughout human history, there had always been an underclass, but has there always been a middle class? That's the question I'm going to address in this video. I'm going to define really what the middle class truly is, and based off of that, what did the middle class look like in different eras of history? Has it always grown? Or are there periods where the middle class has declined for various reasons? And so an inaccurate definition of the middle class really does a disservice really to everybody trying to have discourse about this subject. Welcome to Analyzing Finance with Nick. We're having another social class old money video where we're going to be talking about the history of the middle class. First, let's define what the middle class is, because the very broad political definition of the middle class is anybody in the 25th to the 70th fifth percentile of the income brackets, which in American society today would put you at anywhere from $30,000 to about $120,000 a year, which I don't really think is a reflection of what the middle class truly is. And so if you wanted to have a more accurate framework, you have to look at what do we define a middle class as in terms of actual purchasing power. Like my definition of middle class, somebody who has enough surplus income earned over their career that they'll be able to afford to retire at old age, so like 60 to 65, and maintain their middle class lifestyle in retirement. They should be able to own their primary residence without debt and have a fully paid off mortgage by the time they retire. And they should be able to afford to finance their children's education up to about the equivalent of a bachelor's degree today, and have other creature comforts in life. But those are the three main ones. If you can cover those three, you probably fit all the other definitions of middle class. And that's always been a very small and historically rare socioeconomic group. And the real middle class is a fraction of what people actually perceive the middle class to be. Like, even in modern times, the middle class is maybe anywhere from the top 2 to 30 percentiles, the second to the 30th percentile of earners. So maybe the closer definition of the middle class by my definition would be 90K to 400,000 USD would be the real middle class. Intuitively, that sounds about right to me. I don't know about you guys. That's enough money that you can retire comfortably, but it's not enough you're going to be building truly generational wealth or being able to live the lifestyles of the elite or use your wealth and privilege to actually influence politics and greater society in a material way. So I think that's kind of the line I have for the quote unquote middle class. However, also my definition of middle class too is that you have that income level, but it's also coming from one single source. Whereas like professional class people, independent professional class people are not necessarily middle class because they are more diversified. But for the definition of this video and the American class hierarchy chart that I use, I'm considering middle class anybody in the actual middle class definition from that video, and also those in the independent professional class, the institutional professional class, and the lower end of the successful business owner class. So let's go in the old days, like before there was the agricultural revolution and hunter-gatherer societies, there was no middle class because there was really no class because there was no surplus. And without surplus, there's no excess assets to distribute after dinner time. So we're going to move on at least to the ancient world. So the ancient world like Greece, Rome, ancient China, India, etc. They did have a middle class. This is often like artisans, particularly skilled artisans like blacksmiths and the like, physicians, smaller merchants, scribes, because given like the complication of writing back then and low literacy rates, it was a pretty high paid job just to be able to read and write. Maybe there are some yeoman independent farmers who might be in this category, but there weren't that many middle class professions back then either, because the market economy had really not been developed in the way that we have today. It was mostly plunder-based economies back then. And based on it, these type of people, they didn't have enough wealth that they can really compete for power with the nobility, but they were able to afford to own a piece of urban property, probably send their kid to an apprenticeship, and they were also the bulk of the taxpayers because the nobility, since they were on the top of the pyramid, felt entitled to live off the taxpayers, and the very poor didn't really have anything to collect apart from maybe a a fraction of their grain harvest. So back then, just like today, the middle class were the bulk of the taxpayers in urban societies, especially. And so, yeah, oftentimes they lost their middle class status because of that, or war or political things, because a lot of middle class jobs were directly more tied to the state in ancient society as well, or connections to nobility personally. So like the middle class back then was like the Ivy League class, essentially today. And it's similar to that. The percentage of the population of the middle class back then was similar. It's like 1% to 5% at the most. So if the nobility, the high priests and the elite clergy and the ruling class was a combined, say, 1% of the population, then maybe add another 1% to 4% of the population on top of that. And that is the middle class. So the middle class wasn't much bigger than the upper classes back then, mainly due to just a limited opportunities to have skilled labor. If we move on to medieval times, middle class actually went down due to decentralization of the imperial regimes and basically just less geopolitical security and more just fractured, violent societies as a product of the Dark Ages. You saw retrenchment. A lot of previous property owners could no longer afford to educate their children or had to go work as a peasant to keep themselves alive. And so the middle class dropped from, say, up to 5% of the population down to maybe up to just about another 1% to 2% of the population. So it got cut by 60% or more. And the clergy took the role of a skilled labor, especially in Europe, that was previously held by a lot of the proto-middle classes in ancient society. So like monks were the ones who were literate, and a lot of the church were the people who were doing a lot of the middle class advisory type roles. They were still skilled artisans, but in the peasant medieval era, they just, due to relatively high population relative to resources, they just weren't paid very much. A lot of them were just as tied to the land as peasants. So the artisans, except for the most skilled ones, had limited bargaining power until basically the plague changed the labor market. The middle class held up a little bit more in the Islamic world and in China, where you had upward mobility through exams that anybody really had access to take, but at very low rates of passing, kind of similar to a bar exam today or a CFA. And those people who could make it through that were basically the middle class of ancient China. And yeah, the Islamic world kept a lot of the more old middle class jobs from the ancient world, such as scholars and physicians and judges and other things like that. As languages got more simplified, the need for scribes had declined because the modern Greek, Latin, and Arabic scripts were a lot easier to become literate and to write, and were more accessible to write than more ancient forms of written language. But in general, the medieval times were a very bad era to be middle class. Knights were the other really member of the middle class in Europe, like the enforcer classes. And they had the skill training that was common for middle class throughout history, but it was probably more for martial means than for the merchant economy. And then really at the age of exploration, the middle class started to get back up to the level it was in ancient times, so about 2% to 5%. There are new groups like some artisans that became more skilled with advancement in mechanical technology. You have people who were going to the new world to explore and gaining wealth that way. You had the development of the legal system. So you had lawyers for the first time, development of double entry accounting. So you had like accountants and tax accountants and all that. This was the invention of the stock market. So you had the securities industry in a very primitive form. Both of the bond market and the stock market developed in this time. Like the Dutch Republic had a lot more middle class than other countries because they were the ones that were innovating in a lot of these new methods of finance. And they were also one of the leading colonizing and exploration international trade countries. And that's why a lot of people did try to explore the new world or get involved in international trade and sailing, because it often offered a much higher quality of life and much higher pay than simply staying at home and working at your family's farm. And the economic structure changed radically due to the bubonic plague, reducing the population to the point where labor actually had bargaining power in early modern Europe. And in other parts of the world, the middle class never really grew from medieval levels because those societies remained more ossified and didn't really adopt a lot of the innovations that were going on in Europe at the time. The next real stage is the Industrial Revolution, where you started to see the middle class be sizable enough to actually influence politics, and also just more democratic societies means that you had more people actually able to vote. And the middle class was also known a lot of times as the bourgeoisie, which also was proto-new money, grew to about 10% of the population in the US and industrialized European populations. In more developing nations was maybe closer. And the middle class where it was strongest was in Britain, the US, France, Germany, the Low Countries, and somewhat to a certain degree in Spain as well, and in northern Italy. And yeah, this is when, again, with technology advancing, it created more high-skilled jobs. So you still had lawyers, you still had physicians, you still had bureaucrats, you still had accountants, but now you have more engineers and skilled labor and architects and things to actually like build the advanced machinery and equipment and buildings and other properties needed for a modern urban society. And the first development of modern cities created a lot of the jobs that we take for granted that are considered middle-class jobs, but still most people were working subsistence wages in the factories. However, like the manager of the factory in like by 1830 could actually afford to buy a home and to retire and maybe send their kids to a good school. But it was also the first time you actually saw people have some upward mobility. And then as it advanced, starting in the mid-19th century up to about World War, the middle class grew even bigger and it got to about 15% in Western Europe and the US. Again, as the financial markets, as modern technology, in terms of industrial equipment particularly, and modern transportation, like all the stuff to service cars and trains and airplanes, create a lot of middle-class jobs. Electricity and the advent of indoor plumbing created middle-class jobs for like electricians and plumbers and things like that for the first time. And you need supervisors, and a lot more supervisors than the past because factories and farms became commercialized and were at much larger scale. So you also had the presence of the American frontier. And so America by far had the highest middle class at this point because you basically were able to give land for people for nearly free, basically anywhere west of Kansas City. And as long as they worked to build it, they could build a middle class living as a farmer or working at any job in these frontier towns that required some sort of skill. And this was probably one of the highest points of social mobility as well. And you had overall, generally until 1913, a deflationary economy. So if you saved, the value of your savings actually went up without the need for financial speculation. So a lot of wealth was developed. And even though the Gilded Age was very skewed towards the wealthy, it's also the highest percentage of middle class in human history at that time. And then after World War, you really started to see the peak of the global middle class, particularly in the OECD countries. World War eliminated a lot of the supply-demand imbalances created by the Great Depression, particularly in population, and as well as excess manufacturing capacity. Unions were strong that kept wages high for a lot of the working class. And in the US particularly, the working class had middle class and higher wages oftentimes because the rest of the world's capacity was destroyed by World War II. The GI Bill allowed a lot of people who fought in World War II to go to college for free or at subsidized rates and were able to move into the middle class due to having a college education. Housing was cheap. This was the advent of the 30-year mortgage was about this period of time, and suburbanization, which greatly opened up land supply because people didn't have to live as close to the city for their work as they used to. And really at the peak of this, like in the 60s, like one full-time job at a lower middle class type profession, like a factory worker, lower end engineers, teachers, entry level, like accounting, underperforming salespeople, etc. Like even those type of professions that could not do this today were able to buy homes, fund retirement, and pay for their own kids' college with no debt. This was also a less financialized economy too, and you had the government interfering less in certain industries that their regulations have caused a massive increase in cost, mainly healthcare, education, and housing. And the impact of these regulations didn't really happen until at least the 1980s, with Medicare being passed in the late 60s, the government guaranteeing student loans in the early 1970s, and then with the housing market, you had the 40-year bull market of bonds, really consistent trend in interest rates going down in the 80s, and the environmentalist movement becoming popular in the 80s and the 90s, which promoted a lot of NIMBY anti-development laws that really started to gain traction in this point. I mean, there were some in earlier eras, like the Santa Barbara moratoriums that happened in the mid-20th century. But in general, a lot of the supply constrained policies for real estate really were not enacted until the last few decades. And so basically since the 1980s, you've seen a hollowing out of the middle class. And the reason really why that's the case is a number of things that I've talked about in this channel before. You have globalization, you have the internet creating a more winner-take-all economy, you have the government trying to compensate through excessive deficits or excessive easy credit, which basically is creating more buying power than the economy can sustain through leverage. And that's making the cost of living a lot higher than it would be otherwise. And financialization in general is helping make the cost of living higher. And as technology continues to advance, it's not advancing to the point like in the Industrial Revolution where technology created a lot more skilled jobs that it took away. It got more even. And I think with the advent of AI, it's going to start to go negative where the jobs taken away from efficiencies and technological gains are going to outweigh the new ones created to service a more complex society. And also the problem is the skills gap to a certain degree where a lot of the jobs that are being created require a lot more skills and a lot more education, which a lot of people who are previously in the middle class do not have the aptitude or the desire or the resources to be able to acquire. And so it's creating a major problem. And then just in general, the fall of the Berlin Wall globally just increased the global labor supply, and immigration, mass immigration in Western countries increased labor supply. Women entering the workforce rapidly increased labor supply. And the increase in jobs hasn't really been slow enough to keep wages going up faster than inflation. So like at the peak, let's just say 30% of the population was the true middle class, say in the 50s and the 60s. Nowadays, by that same definition, it's probably closer to about 10 to 20%. The 90th percentile of income in America is $135,000 a year for an individual. And for a household, it's closer to $200,000 a year. So that easily would be comfortable middle class level. And if you wanted to have the and based on where housing prices are, to have the historical multiple of housing prices be about 4x, then you need to make about $110,000 a year as a household income, which if we put that, or just 106 figures in general is the line for a household, so like a whole family of being middle class, that would put it in the 66th percentile. So by that number, you still have about a third of Americans being middle class, but that's still the more generous assumption. And it's anywhere from 10 to 33%, depending on what your metric of middle class is. It also depends on where you live, as well as a variety of this. But that's still way lower than the 50 to 75% of Americans who claim to be in the middle class. And that's where I think a lot of the cognitive dissonances in our politics and our discussion about this. There's always been a middle class, but it's always been far smaller than people would like to admit. And will the middle class grow or shrink over time? It really depends on if you have policies and incentive structures in the economy that reward productivity and have more diffuse sources of wealth. I think on one hand, the AI and robots are very dangerous for the middle class, just like they are for the working class, because a lot of white collar jobs are going to be obviated. And the next level of cognitive ability to be the ones who either can fix this AI or be able to use that data from the AI to make bigger, more impactful decisions is a smaller percentage of the population. But on the other hand, I could argue too that this could be positive for the middle class because these tools allow you to be a lot more productive than you would on your own in a previous era. Like a middle class person will be able to afford a ChatGPT subscription and to buy one of these robots. At the way things are going, we're going to, within a decade, have humanoid robots that cost about the same as an average car in the United States. And most middle class people can buy a car. So if you can buy this type of equipment, whether it's for your startup or to help with domestic chores at home, the middle class can actually be a lot more abundant because the cost of being a middle class person may drop dramatically due to these deflationary technologies, or middle class people can be their own businesses and use these technologies to be able to run a business that previously required 5 to 20 people staffs by themselves or just as a family cottage industry, like you do it as a family. And this could be actually the revival of the middle class. So it's to be determined, honestly. Really depends on how this technology is leveraged and whether the education system can adapt in a way to teach people how to build new things with this technology and create their ability to be somebody who works at a much bigger scale than an individual person did in past generations. And the increased productivity should lead to either increased wages or increased income from entrepreneurial opportunities that come from this. So I'm actually not as pessimistic about the future of middle class as my analysis would be. I mean, if you have regulatory restrictions to economic growth or political policies that promote inflation to continue to go up faster than productivity, then the middle class is going to die, just like what happens with any other economically populous country. See the histories of Argentina and Brazil and Italy if you want to know more details on that kind of thing, or Spain and Portugal too. If you want, but assuming that path doesn't happen, there actually is a possibility that we can utilize the technological developments in the present to create a stronger, more self-sufficient middle class in the future. Let me know your thoughts. Do you think the middle class is dying? Do you think that I am underestimating the size of the middle class relative to what your definition is? And do you think that my idea that the people in politics and society generally misleading and lying to working class people and saying they're middle class is one of the bigger problems in society that is not discussed? Let me know your comments, and thank you for watching.